Bill Gates has now publicly acknowledged mistakes from his past, including private relationships and his decision to associate with Jeffrey Epstein. And for the first time, he addressed it directly to his own foundation staff, not in a press conference, not in an interview, but inside a closed town hall, answering questions submitted by the very people who work closest to him. He apologized. He took responsibility for certain decisions, and at the same time he firmly stated that he was not involved in anything illicit. So what exactly did he say? And why is this moment bringing renewed attention to events from over a decade ago? Because according to publicly available reporting, this wasn't just about the past. It was about transparency, accountability, and how even the most influential figures face questions that don't simply disappear. And what he revealed may explain far more than people expected. The moment happened during a scheduled internal town hall at the Gates Foundation on February 24th. These meetings, reportedly held twice a year, allow employees to submit questions directly to Bill Gates about the foundation's work, its future, and sometimes his own decisions. This time, however, the questions weren't only about global health or artificial intelligence, they were about his past. According to reports, Gates spoke candidly. He acknowledged having had personal relationships during his marriage, specifically mentioning two women he met through professional and social circles. One, reportedly, was a bridge player he met at competitive events. The other, a scientist he encountered through business-related activities. But he didn't frame it as a scandal. He framed it as something else, a mistake. And that distinction matters. Because Gates wasn't speaking to defend his image in public. He was speaking to the people responsible for carrying forward the mission of one of the world's largest charitable foundations. And that raises an important question. Why address this now? The answer appears to be tied to renewed public discussion surrounding his past association with Jeffrey Epstein. Gates acknowledged during the town hall that spending time with Epstein was, in his words, a huge mistake. But he also clarified something very directly. He said he never participated in anything illicit and never witnessed illicit activity. That statement was clear, deliberate, and carefully worded. Still, the existence of their past association has continued to raise questions, not necessarily about illegal involvement, but about judgment. And that distinction is where the real story begins, because their connection didn't start the way many assume. According to Gates' previous public explanations, he initially met Epstein in 2011. At the time, Gates was deeply focused on expanding philanthropic initiatives, particularly global health programs that required massive funding and partnerships. Epstein reportedly presented himself as someone with connections to wealthy individuals who could support those efforts. And for someone trying to accelerate global health funding, those connections may have appeared valuable. But hindsight changes perspective. Gates himself acknowledged that he did not fully understand the extent of Epstein's past at the time, or at least did not fully appreciate the implications of continuing contact. And that realization, years later, became something he openly expressed regret over. But here's where things become even more complex, because the consequences of those decisions weren't immediate. They unfolded slowly, over time. His meetings with Epstein reportedly continued until around 2014. And during the town hall, Gates emphasized that he never stayed overnight at Epstein's properties and never participated in the types of activities that later became widely reported. Still, he made something else very clear. He apologized, not only for the decisions themselves, but for the impact those decisions had on others around him. "I apologize to other people who are drawn into this," he reportedly told staff. That statement reveals something important. This wasn't just about personal regret. It was about institutional responsibility, because the Gates Foundation operates in a space where trust is essential. Governments, researchers, and organizations around the world partner with the foundation based not only on its funding, but on its credibility. And credibility can be affected by perception just as much as reality. Which raises another critical question. How did this affect the foundation itself? According to Gates, he acknowledged that situations like this can cast a shadow over the foundation's work, even if the work itself remains unchanged. He emphasized that the foundation's mission and its values are larger than any one individual, but internally addressing the issue directly may have been necessary to maintain transparency with staff. And transparency in situations like this often determines whether trust weakens or strengthens. Because avoiding the conversation can sometimes create more uncertainty than confronting it openly. Still, there's one detail that makes this moment different from anything he's said before. He wasn't speaking through a spokesperson. He wasn't issuing a prepared public statement. He was answering questions in real time, and that changes the meaning of everything. Because when someone chooses to address difficult topics voluntarily, it often signals something deeper than public relations. It signals recognition. Recognition that leadership isn't only defined by achievements, but also by accountability. And yet, this moment also connects to a much larger turning point in his personal life, one that happened years later. His divorce. In 2021, Bill and Melinda French Gates officially announced the end of their 27-year marriage. At the time, both emphasized their continued commitment to the foundation, but also acknowledged that their personal paths were changing. And according to Melinda herself, she had expressed concerns about Epstein long before their separation, which adds another layer to the timeline, because it suggests that questions surrounding Epstein weren't only public, they were also personal, and understanding that timeline may explain why Gates chose to speak so directly now, not to rewrite the past, but to acknowledge it. Because when someone's work affects millions of people worldwide, even personal decisions can have broader implications. And that leads to the most important question of all, not what happened, but what happens next. Because legacy isn't built in a single moment. It's built in how someone responds when their decisions are questioned. And in this case, Bill Gates didn't deny that he made mistakes. In fact, he reportedly went further than he had before, openly acknowledging that his association with Epstein was something he regretted deeply. But what makes this moment different isn't just the apology, it's the timing. Because over the past few years, Gates has gradually stepped away from many of his day-to-day roles at Microsoft, shifting his focus almost entirely toward philanthropy, climate initiatives, and global health programs. His identity in the public eye has changed. He's no longer primarily seen as the CEO who built Microsoft. He's seen as someone trying to solve some of the world's biggest problems. And that shift makes trust more important than ever. Because unlike technology, philanthropy depends on cooperation. Governments, scientists, and global leaders choose to work with foundations based on confidence, not obligation, which means reputation becomes part of the foundation's infrastructure. And Gates acknowledged that reality directly. He reportedly told staff that the foundation's work is very reputationally sensitive, meaning people can choose whether or not to collaborate with it. That's an important admission, because it shows awareness that perception alone can influence real-world outcomes. But here's the key detail many people overlook. Despite the renewed attention, there has been no public evidence presented that Gates was involved in illegal wrongdoing related to Epstein. And Gates himself has consistently maintained that he was not involved in illicit activity and did not witness illicit behavior. That distinction matters, not only legally, but historically, because history tends to remember not just events, but responses to those events. And Gates' response has evolved over time. At first, his public comments about Epstein were brief and limited, but as questions continued, his tone became more direct. He called the association a mistake. He acknowledged regret. And now, internally, he has apologized to staff and taken responsibility for the decision to spend time with Epstein. Not because he was forced to in a courtroom, but because he chose to address it in a leadership setting. And that difference changes the context entirely. Because internal accountability often reveals more than public messaging. It reflects what leaders say when speaking to people who already know the full picture. But there's another dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed. Time. More than a decade has passed since Gates' reported meetings with Epstein ended. In that time, Gates has funded billions of dollars in global health initiatives, programs targeting infectious diseases, childhood vaccination access, and clean energy research. His foundation has played a role in efforts that affect millions of lives worldwide. And yet, despite those contributions, moments like this can still resurface and reshape public conversations. Why? Because public trust isn't static. It's constantly being reevaluated, and when new documents, reports, or discussions emerge, they don't just revisit the past, they redefine how the present is understood. Which brings us back to the town hall itself. This wasn't a press event designed to control headlines. It was a meeting intended to answer employee questions. And that context matters, because employees aren't passive observers. They're participants in the mission. They represent the foundation in countries around the world. They interact with partners, governments, and communities. So addressing their concerns directly may have been essential, not just symbolically, but operationally. Because unanswered questions can create uncertainty, and uncertainty can affect confidence. But transparency, even when uncomfortable, can restore clarity. And that may have been the real purpose of the apology, not to change the past, but to stabilize the future. Still, one question remains unanswered. How will this moment influence how history remembers Bill Gates? Will it be seen as a footnote or as a defining moment of accountability? The answer may depend less on the apology itself and more on what happens next. Because in leadership, apologies are only one step. Actions that follow often matter more. And Gates appears to be continuing his focus on global health, climate innovation, and philanthropy, areas he has described as his life's primary mission moving forward. But even as that work continues, public perception evolves, and perception influences legacy, which leads to a deeper realization. This story isn't only about Bill Gates, it's about how public figures navigate transparency in an era where information never truly disappears, and how leadership is tested not only in moments of success, but in moments of reflection. What happened inside that town hall wasn't just an apology. It was a rare look at how one of the world's most influential figures addressed difficult questions directly, without headlines, without cameras, and without certainty about how the public would respond. Because ultimately, legacy isn't defined by perfection. It's defined by how someone responds when their decisions are questioned. And Bill Gates' response raises a broader question that goes far beyond one individual. Can transparency reshape how history remembers a leader? Or does the past always remain part of the story?